Go ahead and call 911. The woman snapped across my backyard, pointing at my barbecue grill as if she had just uncovered the biggest crime our quiet neighborhood had ever seen. At that moment, I realized this was no longer about hamburgers, lawn chairs, or a peaceful Saturday afternoon. It was about pride, assumptions, and a lesson that nobody standing on my driveway was prepared to learn. My name is Ethan Carter, and until that afternoon, I believed the loudest thing my neighbors would hear all weekend was my 6-year-old daughter laughing while she chased bubbles across our backyard. The smell of smoked ribs drifted through the warm summer air as charcoal crackled beneath the grill. Country music played softly from a portable speaker near the patio, and my wife carried fresh lemonade toward the folding table where my parents were arranging homemade potato salad beside a bowl of watermelon. Everything about the day felt ordinary, exactly the way we wanted it. My father, Robert Carter, leaned comfortably against the backyard fence with a paper plate in one hand, smiling as he watched his grandchildren race across the freshly cut grass. Retirement had suited him well. He never looked for attention, never talked about his previous career, and always reminded me that the best weekends were the ones that ended with tired kids, empty serving trays, and grateful hearts. We had invited my brother, my cousins, and several close friends for a simple family barbecue. Cars filled our driveway, children laughed beneath the old maple tree, and the entire neighborhood smelled like charcoal, barbecue sauce, and fresh-cut grass. Then everything changed. A sharp voice cut through the music before I even saw who was speaking. Linda Harper marched across the sidewalk, carrying a clipboard so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. She wore perfectly pressed business casual clothes, sunglasses resting above carefully styled blonde hair, and an expression that suggested she had already decided how the afternoon would end. She stopped just outside our property line and announced loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear that our gathering violated homeowners association rules and would be ending immediately. Conversations around the picnic table slowly faded. My daughter looked toward me with confused eyes while my wife quietly lowered the pitcher of lemonade onto the table. I walked toward the front of the yard, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides and my voice calm. I politely asked Linda which specific rule she believed we had violated. Instead of answering directly, she pointed toward the grill, then toward the parked vehicles, before claiming the neighborhood had become overcrowded, noisy, and unsafe. None of her accusations matched reality. We were entirely on our own property. Every vehicle was legally parked, and our music was so quiet I could still hear birds singing from the trees behind our fence. I reached into my pocket, opened the Homeowners Association guidelines on my phone, and quietly began recording our conversation without announcing it. Years ago, my father taught me that facts always outlasted emotions. Linda interpreted my calm expression as hesitation. She smiled confidently, pulled out her own phone, and dialed 911. She spoke with complete certainty, describing our peaceful family barbecue as though it were creating a serious emergency. Around us, curtains moved, garage doors opened, and neighbors slowly stepped outside to watch what would happen next. My father never interrupted. He simply folded his lawn chair, walked over beside my family, and rested one reassuring hand on my shoulder. He quietly reminded me that the truth never needed to rush because it always arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Linda lowered her phone with a look of complete satisfaction, as though the outcome had already been decided before anyone else had spoken a single word. She folded her arms and looked directly at me with a confident smile that suggested she expected flashing lights to appear at any second and put an end to our afternoon. Around us, the neighborhood seemed to pause. The gentle laughter from my nieces faded into quiet whispers. The sound of sizzling charcoal became strangely louder now that everyone had stopped talking. Even the breeze rustling through the maple tree felt slower as neighbors continued stepping onto their porches to see why someone had called emergency services to our street. My wife walked closer to me, keeping one arm around our daughter, who looked more confused than frightened. I smiled at both of them and quietly assured them that everything was going to be all right. There was nothing to hide because we had done nothing wrong. My father remained exactly where he was, standing comfortably beside the picnic table with the same relaxed posture he had maintained all afternoon. He did not interrupt Linda. He did not challenge her accusations. Instead, he watched carefully, almost as though he had seen situations like this unfold many times before. That calmness helped steady the rest of us. Linda broke the silence by announcing loudly enough for every nearby neighbor to hear that homeowners association rules existed for a reason and that families who ignored them deserved consequences. I politely asked once more which written rule she believed prohibited a private family barbecue on our own property. Instead of pointing to a specific section, she spoke generally about excessive gatherings, neighborhood standards, and possible safety concerns. I quietly opened the digital copy of the Homeowners Association handbook on my phone and slowly scrolled through the sections she mentioned. None of them prohibited what we were doing. Every page only strengthened my confidence that facts would eventually speak for themselves. My brother noticed what I was doing and began taking wide photographs of the backyard, carefully showing the legal parking, the clean property, and the reasonable size of the gathering. My wife snapped pictures of the grill, the seating area, and the open walkways. Nobody rushed. Nobody argued. We simply documented the afternoon exactly as it was. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson stepped onto her driveway carrying a cup of iced tea. She had lived in the neighborhood longer than almost anyone else and had watched our family grow over the years. She quietly waved at me before turning her attention toward Linda, clearly surprised by how serious the situation had become. A few more neighbors joined her, speaking softly among themselves while trying to understand why such a peaceful gathering had suddenly attracted so much attention. Nearly 10 minutes passed before the distant sound of a patrol vehicle echoed through the neighborhood. The conversation stopped almost instantly. Linda straightened her posture and smiled again, convinced that everything was unfolding exactly as she had planned. I slipped my phone into my pocket, keeping the recording active, then gently squeezed my daughter's shoulder and reminded her that honesty never had anything to fear. As the patrol vehicle slowly turned onto our street and rolled toward our driveway beneath the bright afternoon sun, I noticed my father quietly glance toward the approaching officers with the faintest hint of recognition in his eyes, though he said absolutely nothing as the cruiser came to a smooth stop beside the curb. The patrol car came to a smooth stop along the curb, and the flashing lights reflected softly across the polished paint of the vehicles parked in my driveway before fading into stillness. Two uniformed officers stepped out with calm, professional expressions, neither rushing nor showing the slightest sign that they expected trouble. They walked toward us with measured confidence, taking in the backyard, the neatly arranged tables, the children sitting quietly beside their parents, and the smell of barbecue drifting through the warm afternoon air. Nothing about our property resembled the emergency Linda had described. I stepped forward before anyone else could speak and greeted both officers politely. They returned the greeting and asked what had happened. Before I could answer, Linda confidently interrupted, explaining that our gathering violated homeowners association rules, created a public disturbance, blocked the neighborhood, and presented a safety concern that required immediate police intervention. One officer listened patiently without interrupting while the other slowly looked around the property. His eyes moved from the grill to the driveway, then across the lawn where my daughter quietly held my wife's hand. I waited until Linda finished before calmly explaining that we were hosting a private family barbecue on our own property, that every vehicle was legally parked, that our music remained at a reasonable volume, and that I had a copy of the Homeowners Association guidelines available if anyone wished to review them. I also mentioned that I had documented the entire interaction from the moment the disagreement began. The officers thanked both of us for remaining cooperative and explained they would simply verify the situation themselves. They walked through the visible portions of the property without entering private areas unnecessarily. One officer counted the vehicles while the other observed the clear sidewalks, unobstructed street, and open driveway. They quietly exchanged a few observations before asking whether they could review the Homeowners Association rule Linda believed had been violated. She searched through several printed pages on her clipboard before pointing toward a section discussing community standards, but the language she referenced never prohibited private family gatherings on a homeowner's property. I handed one officer the same section displayed on my phone, and he carefully compared the wording. His expression remained professional, but I noticed a slight change as he reread the paragraph a second time. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson politely confirmed that our family had been respectful all afternoon and that the neighborhood had been peaceful until the argument began. Another neighbor added that traffic had never been blocked and that everyone attending the barbecue had parked responsibly. The officers thanked each witness without encouraging unnecessary discussion. My father remained quietly beside the picnic table, saying almost nothing while watching the conversation unfold with remarkable patience. He occasionally smiled at my grandchildren as though this were simply another ordinary afternoon. One of the officers glanced toward him for just a moment longer than expected, his expression suggesting a faint sense of familiarity before returning his attention to the investigation. Linda noticed the pause but assumed it meant the officers were finally beginning to agree with her. She stepped forward once again, insisting that someone needed to be held responsible because homeowners association authority could not simply be ignored. The older officer calmly explained that their responsibility was to evaluate facts, not assumptions, and that every decision would be based on what they personally observed. As the investigation continued beneath the bright summer sky, I could feel the atmosphere beginning to shift, not because anyone had raised a voice, but because the truth was quietly becoming impossible to overlook. The older officer handed my phone back after comparing the Homeowners Association guidelines with Linda's printed pages, then slowly looked across the backyard one more time as though making certain he had not overlooked a single detail. The only sounds were children talking quietly beneath the maple tree, the gentle crackle of charcoal beneath the grill, and birds singing somewhere beyond the wooden fence. Nothing resembled the dangerous situation described during the emergency call. The younger officer walked toward the driveway, counted each parked vehicle again, and confirmed that every one of them was completely within legal parking boundaries. He measured the remaining space along the street with his eyes before nodding slightly to his partner. Linda noticed the silent exchange and immediately stepped forward, convinced the officers had finally reached the conclusion she expected. She insisted that the Homeowners Association could not function if residents simply ignored community expectations. The older officer politely explained that community expectations and enforceable violations were not always the same thing. He reminded everyone that his responsibility was to evaluate observable facts rather than assumptions or personal disagreements. I could almost feel the tension shifting as several neighbors quietly exchanged glances. Mrs. Henderson folded her arms with a satisfied smile, while another neighbor casually remarked that our family hosted gatherings every summer without ever disturbing anyone. My wife continued serving lemonade to relatives as though refusing to allow the argument to steal the afternoon from our children. My daughter offered a paper plate with cookies to her grandfather, who accepted it with the same calm smile he had worn since Linda first walked onto the sidewalk. Watching him remain completely relaxed somehow made everyone else feel calmer as well. The younger officer eventually approached my father with a friendly expression and casually asked whether he lived nearby or was simply visiting family for the weekend. My father answered politely that he had been enjoying retirement and spending as much time with his grandchildren as possible. The officer smiled, studying his face for another brief moment before thanking him for cooperating. As he turned away, he paused almost imperceptibly, as though a distant memory had surfaced without fully revealing itself. I noticed the hesitation, but my father gave no indication that anything unusual had happened. He simply returned his attention to my daughter, helping her balance a cup of lemonade without spilling it. Linda mistook the brief conversation as another opportunity to press her case. She stepped closer to the officers and insisted that Homeowners Association authority deserved greater respect from residents. The older officer calmly responded that respect worked best when accompanied by fairness, consistency, and clear evidence. He explained that after reviewing the property, listening to witnesses, and examining the relevant community guidelines, he had not found any indication that our family had violated any law or any rule requiring police intervention. The words settled over the neighborhood like the first cool breeze after a hot afternoon. Linda's confident expression faltered for the first time since arriving at our house, but she quickly insisted that someone higher within the department should review the situation. The younger officer looked once more toward my father, narrowing his eyes slightly before quietly asking a simple question that immediately caught everyone's attention. He asked whether they had ever met before because my father's face seemed remarkably familiar. My father smiled politely, almost amused by the question, but answered only that it had been a long career and that he had met many dedicated officers over the Years. Neither officer responded immediately, yet I could see recognition beginning to replace uncertainty as the final pieces slowly came together. The younger officer remained unusually quiet for several seconds after my father answered, his attention lingering on him while the rest of the neighborhood waited for someone to speak. The older officer noticed the expression on his partner's face and glanced toward my father once again, studying him more carefully than before. My father simply smiled, took a slow sip of lemonade, and thanked my daughter for bringing him another paper napkin. There was nothing dramatic about his posture. If anything, he seemed completely uninterested in becoming the center of attention. Linda interpreted the silence differently. She stepped forward with renewed confidence and insisted that delaying action only encouraged homeowners to ignore community standards. She reminded the officers that she had called because she believed immediate intervention was necessary and repeated that the Homeowners Association expected cooperation from every resident. The older officer acknowledged her concerns with the same professional courtesy he had shown since arriving, then explained that every complaint required objective verification before any conclusion could be reached. He pointed toward the printed guidelines, the photographs, and the statements provided by nearby neighbors, noting that every piece of available information supported the same conclusion. Our family was peacefully enjoying a private gathering on our own property without violating any law that required police action. Linda looked frustrated but refused to step back. She suggested that perhaps someone with greater authority inside the department should review the situation because she believed important details had been overlooked. The younger officer looked toward my father again, this time with growing certainty, before quietly asking one more question. He asked whether my father had served with the department many years earlier. My father nodded politely and answered that he had spent most of his career there before retiring, adding that he still enjoyed seeing younger officers continue the profession with integrity. The younger officer smiled faintly, as though a forgotten memory had suddenly become perfectly clear. He turned toward his partner and softly mentioned that he had just remembered seeing my father's portrait displayed in the department headquarters while attending orientation several years before. The older officer looked back at my father, and recognition slowly appeared across his face as well. Neither officer changed his professional attitude. Neither became less objective. If anything, both seemed even more careful to ensure every word reflected fairness rather than familiarity. Linda noticed the subtle change immediately, but could not understand what had caused it. She looked from one officer to the other before asking whether something had changed. The older officer calmly replied that nothing about the investigation had changed because the facts remained exactly the same. He explained that evidence, witness statements, and direct observation still showed no violation requiring police enforcement. Around us, the tension continued to fade as neighbors quietly resumed conversations among themselves. My wife handed fresh lemonade to several relatives. My brother returned to checking the grill, and my daughter laughed when a gentle breeze carried a few soap bubbles across the backyard. It was almost as though the afternoon was patiently reclaiming the peace it had enjoyed before the argument began. Even so, I could tell the biggest moment of the day had not yet arrived. The expressions on both officers made that unmistakably clear. They had finally remembered exactly who my father was, but neither intended to let his reputation influence their judgment. Instead, they prepared to acknowledge his identity only after making certain everyone watching understood that the truth had already resolved the situation long before any name or title entered the conversation. The younger officer took one careful step toward my father before stopping beside the picnic table, and the thoughtful expression on his face finally turned into quiet certainty. He smiled with genuine respect before extending his hand. My father returned, the handshake warmly, almost as though they were simply two neighbors meeting for the first time instead of standing in the middle of a neighborhood dispute. The older officer looked at my father once more before his own face brightened with recognition. He politely apologized for not remembering sooner, explaining that he had only seen photographs and department history displays years earlier. My father laughed softly and assured him there was nothing to apologize for because retirement had given him the opportunity to enjoy being known simply as a grandfather instead of by his former profession. Linda watched the exchange with growing confusion. She looked from one officer to the other before asking why everyone suddenly seemed so familiar. The older officer answered calmly without any hesitation. He explained that my father was Robert Carter, the city's retired police chief, whose years of service were still remembered with great respect throughout the department. Several neighbors quietly looked toward my father with surprise. My wife smiled, but said nothing because our family had never considered his former position something that needed to be announced. My father immediately raised one hand with a gentle smile before anyone could misunderstand the moment. He thanked the officers for their kind words, but added something I had heard him say many times while growing up. He explained that his former title should have absolutely no influence over the investigation because every resident deserved equal treatment under the law. If his family had violated any regulation, he expected the officers to handle the situation exactly as they would for anyone else. Both officers nodded immediately. The younger officer explained that their conclusion had already been reached before recognizing my father because the evidence had been clear from the beginning. They had personally inspected the property, reviewed the homeowners association guidelines, listened to independent witnesses, and confirmed that no violation requiring police action had occurred. The older officer added that emergency services existed to respond to genuine public safety concerns and that disagreements over community rules should never be presented as emergencies without a legitimate basis. Linda opened her mouth as though preparing another argument, but after looking around the yard, she realized every available fact pointed in the same direction. The neighbors had witnessed a peaceful family gathering. The officers had verified every detail themselves. Even the written community guidelines supported our position. My father thanked the officers for approaching the situation with professionalism instead of assumptions. He quietly told my daughter that the best decisions were always made after listening carefully rather than reacting quickly. She smiled proudly, repeating his words almost as though she wanted to remember them forever. The atmosphere changed completely. Conversations slowly returned to normal. My brother checked the grill again. Laughter drifted back across the backyard, and the familiar smell of smoked ribs once again became the strongest presence in the warm afternoon air. Before returning to their patrol vehicle, both officers shook my father's hand once more, then thanked our entire family for remaining patient and cooperative throughout the investigation. As they walked back toward the street beneath the bright summer sun, I noticed several neighbors looking less impressed by my father's former position than by the quiet humility with which he had carried it. In that moment, I understood the greatest surprise of the afternoon had never been his identity. It had been the reminder that genuine authority was measured not by a title remembered from the past, but by the integrity someone continued to demonstrate long after the title was gone. The patrol car disappeared slowly around the corner, and for the first time since Linda had walked onto the sidewalk, the neighborhood sounded like itself again. The laughter of children gradually replaced the silence that had settled over the street. The charcoal beneath the grill crackled steadily once more, and the familiar smell of barbecue sauce drifted through the warm afternoon air as though the interruption had simply been a passing storm. My wife smiled at me before handing fresh lemonade to my parents, while my brother returned to turning burgers on the grill with an exaggerated sigh of relief that finally made several relatives laugh. The tension that had held everyone still for nearly an hour slowly dissolved into ordinary conversation. Linda, however, remained standing near the edge of the driveway. The confidence she had carried into our yard had faded, replaced by uncertainty as she looked around and realized the attention of the neighborhood was no longer focused on her accusations. Instead, people were quietly discussing how calmly everything had been handled. Mrs. Henderson crossed the street carrying her glass of iced tea and thanked our family for remaining patient from beginning to end. She admitted she had expected raised voices once emergency services arrived, but instead she had watched the situation become calmer because everyone except one person had chosen facts over emotion. Several other neighbors nodded in agreement. One family mentioned they had attended neighborhood gatherings at our house for years without ever experiencing noise, parking problems, or disrespect toward anyone living nearby. Another neighbor quietly admitted that this was not the first time Linda had confronted residents over situations that later turned out to be perfectly acceptable under the community guidelines. Those comments were never spoken with anger. They sounded more like people finally recognizing a pattern they had previously dismissed as isolated incidents. Linda attempted one final explanation, insisting she had only been trying to protect neighborhood standards. My father answered with the same calm voice he had used all afternoon. He told her that strong communities absolutely depended on standards, but they depended even more on fairness, consistency, and neighbors treating one another with respect before assuming the worst. He explained that written rules were meant to create understanding, not unnecessary conflict. Nobody applauded his words because they did not need to. The quiet expressions around the yard showed that nearly everyone had reached the same conclusion on their own. Watching my father speak reminded me that his greatest strength had never been authority. It had always been his ability to remain steady while everyone else became emotional. My daughter tugged gently on my sleeve and asked whether the barbecue could finally continue. I smiled, picked up the tongs from the grill, and told her the afternoon had never really belonged to the argument in the first place. It belonged to our family. That simple answer seemed to lift the last trace of tension from the backyard. Music quietly filled the air again. Children returned to chasing bubbles across the grass. Relatives gathered around folding tables covered with homemade desserts, and neighbors who had only planned to watch from their driveways slowly accepted invitations to join us for a plate of food. As I looked around the backyard filled with conversation instead of conflict, I realized something unexpected had happened. Linda had called emergency services believing she could isolate our family from the neighborhood. Instead, the afternoon had brought the neighborhood closer together than I had ever seen before, proving that honesty, patience, and quiet integrity often inspired stronger communities than any rule ever could. During the following week, I noticed something I had never expected. People who had barely exchanged more than a friendly wave for years suddenly stopped to talk whenever we passed each other along the sidewalk. Neighbors who had quietly watched the barbecue from their porches now greeted my family with genuine warmth, asking whether my parents had enjoyed the rest of the weekend and laughing about how quickly the children had returned to chasing bubbles once the patrol car left. It felt as though one difficult afternoon had somehow opened conversations that should have happened years earlier. Mrs. Henderson invited several families to meet for coffee one morning, and before long the discussion naturally turned toward the events from the barbecue. Nobody spoke with bitterness. Instead, neighbors shared stories about small disagreements that had quietly lingered for years because people had assumed there was no point discussing them. One family described receiving repeated complaints about flower pots that fully complied with community guidelines. Another mentioned being questioned over seasonal decorations even though every deadline had been followed exactly. Listening to those stories, I realized our afternoon had never been an isolated incident. It had simply become the first time enough people had witnessed the same pattern together. A few days later, the monthly Homeowners Association meeting attracted more residents than anyone could remember attending. My wife and I decided to go after several neighbors encouraged us to share exactly what had happened. I carried nothing more than the Homeowners Association handbook, the photographs my brother had taken, and the recording from my phone. My father chose not to speak unless someone asked him directly because he believed the discussion belonged to the homeowners, not to his former profession. The meeting began respectfully. Board members invited residents to speak one at a time, and every person remained surprisingly calm despite the emotions surrounding recent events. When my turn arrived, I simply described the timeline exactly as it had happened. I explained how Linda had approached our family barbecue, which sections of the Homeowners Association handbook we reviewed together, how the responding officers conducted their investigation, and why documentation mattered more than assumptions. I never mentioned my father's former position until one board member specifically asked why the officers had recognized him. Even then, I repeated what my father had said in our backyard. His identity had changed nothing because the officers reached their conclusion before they knew who he was. Several neighbors then shared experiences remarkably similar to ours. One by one, they described situations where conversations might have solved misunderstandings long before formal complaints became necessary. The board members listened carefully, comparing each concern with the written community guidelines. By the end of the meeting, they agreed that future complaints would include specific references to the applicable rules before formal action could be considered, and they encouraged neighbors to communicate directly whenever possible, before escalating ordinary disagreements. Nobody celebrated because nobody had come looking for a victory over another person. The room felt quieter than that. It felt as though everyone had finally remembered that a neighborhood worked best when people treated one another like neighbors instead of opponents. As we walked out beneath the fading evening sky, my father smiled at me and quietly said that lasting change almost always began with ordinary people choosing honesty over pride, one conversation at a time. Several months passed before I truly understood how much that single Saturday afternoon had changed our neighborhood. Summer gradually gave way to crisp autumn mornings, then cooler evenings filled with the smell of fallen leaves instead of barbecue smoke. Yet every time I walked past the maple tree in our front yard, I remembered exactly where Linda had stood when she confidently declared that our family belonged under police investigation. The memory no longer carried frustration. Instead, it reminded me how quickly assumptions could collapse when confronted with patience, evidence, and simple honesty. The new Homeowners Association procedures quietly transformed everyday life throughout the community. Complaints became conversations before they became official reports. Residents were encouraged to meet face-to-face whenever possible, review the written guidelines together, and resolve misunderstandings respectfully before involving the board. To everyone's surprise, the number of formal disputes dropped dramatically within only a few months. Neighbors who had barely spoken for years began working together on seasonal decorations, community cleanup projects, and weekend gatherings for local families. The atmosphere felt lighter, not because the rules had disappeared, but because people finally trusted that the rules would be applied fairly and consistently. Linda gradually became less visible around the neighborhood. On the few occasions we crossed paths, our conversations remained polite and brief. One afternoon, she quietly nodded while passing our driveway, and I returned the greeting without hesitation. There was no reason to carry resentment forward because the lesson had already been learned by everyone who witnessed those events. My father often reminded me that real justice was never measured by someone else's embarrassment. It was measured by whether a difficult experience left a community stronger than it had been before. Looking around our neighborhood, I realized he had been right once again. During the following summer, we decided to host another family barbecue on exactly the same weekend. The folding tables returned to the backyard. Children filled the grass with games and laughter. Relatives carried homemade desserts through the side gate, and the familiar scent of slow-cooked ribs drifted into the warm afternoon air. This time, something unexpected happened. Several neighbors arrived carrying their own dishes to share before we even finished setting the tables. Mrs. Henderson brought homemade pie. Another family carried fresh corn on the cob. Someone else arrived with a cooler full of lemonade for the children. The gathering became less about one household and more about the entire street, enjoying the afternoon together. My father sat beneath the maple tree, watching his grandchildren laugh with children from every corner of the neighborhood. As the sun slowly settled behind the rooftops, he smiled quietly and said that communities were strongest when people remembered they were neighbors long before they were members of any association. I looked around at the conversations, the shared meals, the children running freely across backyards without anyone worrying about unnecessary conflict, and I realized that the greatest victory had never been proving Linda wrong or revealing my father's former position as police chief. The greatest victory was proving that calm voices, documented facts, and mutual respect could accomplish what fear and accusations never could. Every time I smell charcoal smoke drifting through a warm summer evening now, I remember that extraordinary afternoon and the lesson it left behind. Justice never arrived with raised voices or dramatic speeches. It arrived quietly, one verified fact at a time, until the truth became impossible for anyone to ignore.